You're listening to Inspire Change, a broadcast that strives to educate, motivate, and empower men to challenge traditions of masculinity. To guide us through the intricacies and intersections of emotions, relationships, and male identity is renowned psychologist, author, and speaker Gunter Swoboda. This is Inspire Change.
I want to introduce a tradition here for this podcast and all future podcasts, wherein I'd like to respectfully acknowledge the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation. They are the traditional custodians of the land on which we meet. I pay my respects to the elders, past and present. Knowing the stories of the Aboriginal people will always be written in this landscape. Welcome everybody to another episode of Inspired Change. So a lot can happen in a week, in my case. It was the week of my shoulder replacement, so I'm functionally on day 9 of having a new shoulder, which is all very good when I finally get to that place where I've recovered from the post-operative pain and the restrictions that go with it, which with this sort of operation is 6 weeks in a sling. So what does that mean? Well, it means, especially given the fact that I'm right-handed, this is my right shoulder, I'm really restricted in a lot of activity, including having to relearn how to use my mouse with my left hand. So everything fundamentally takes me a lot longer than I anticipate, and also generally includes some form of just a bit of escalation in pain. Now, there's a couple of lessons in this which I thought I'd share up front before I get into the remainder of the episode, which is talking about a few more anxiety disorders and digging a little deeper into that at this point in time. So, in fact, it's sort of timely because there are 2 sources of anxiety in the recovery process, in my view. Okay, now I've had 2 of these, and interestingly enough, instrumentally, they're sort of both a little bit different to one another. Everyone's been saying, oh, you've been through this before, it'll be a walk in the park. Well, number one, not the case. There are some very distinctly qualitative differences between left and right, depending on your orientation, on your dominance. And so in my case, the left was a bit more of a walk in the park because I still had my right and I could feel balanced. So that's one thing. So in this instance, one of my reactions to my dominant hand or dominant side being constricted is that I'm a little less confident in moving around in space, which is really interesting for me because I have an exceptionally good balance without blowing my trumpet. Essentially over 40 years, my wife informed me the other day, it's over 50 years of surfing, means that I've maintained an exceptionally good sort of sense of orientation in space and really, really good balance. So suddenly I'm confronted with this sensation of feeling unstable or less than stable. The other aspect to this is not so much anticipating pain, but actually the effects of the sort of fairly strong pain medication that comes with this, things like the narcotic analgesics. And after a week of essentially smashing these things, I found that at the beginning of this week, I was starting to have this sense of agitation and anxiety that isn't a feature of my sort of being. It's not how I operate generally in the world. So where does that come from? Well, interestingly enough, where it comes from is in fact the medication. So I decided on Monday that I had enough of most of the long-acting narcotics and I'm going to need to take them out. And I'm going to sort of focus mainly on Panadol and Nurofen. So one of the things that happened was that I experienced a slight, not very slight, but a slight level of physiological withdrawal. which amazed me too because, essentially it's only been really over a week of using high doses of these drugs. Now, knowing what this was about made it a lot easier to deal with. I'd imagine if you were someone who didn't necessarily understand pharmacology that well, or hadn't understood the effects of drugs and alcohol on your system, this could be really quite scary. Okay, so this is where I'm talking about, how this experience of mine is relative, is relevant to the topic at hand. And the third thing that keeps popping into my head is I've had a general anaesthetic, and with the medication, my memory and my cognitive function, essentially lacks the clarity, the sharpness that I usually bring to the table. At least I think that I bring to the table. Some may disagree, but we'll chat later. So this has been, again, and from a psychologist's point of view, and a lot of scientists in the old days used to use themselves as a sort of single subject experiment. And I must say that I've been also in my head doing that, observing myself and my reactions to things, and including, my levels of energy, my sense of self-awareness, the sense of being really located within my body, and then somewhat not, from the drugs, somewhat dissociated, feeling really, really vague, missing words. And one of the things that happens with this after a while is I found myself getting quite frustrated. And I would, in a way, act out a little bit by doing things that I knew I shouldn't do. It's important. This is where I come back to this whole notion of self-awareness being central in our capacity to maintain a feeling of sense of security, of safety. Because all of this, with my dominant side being affected like that, has had a kick in the guts. Now, I know it's temporary, which is pretty good. That really, really helps in getting my head around it. So the message is to all of those of you who've had to have this sort of biomechanical surgery, reflect on this. The better you understand the process, the better you understand your body, the better you understand your mind, the better you are going to approach the recovery. Because, one of the things that, is very evident, if I don't spend a lot of time thinking about the physio, I'm more likely to do it. Whereas if I anticipate doing the physio, I get tense because I'm anticipating pain. And so again, coming back into the breath and so on helps to do this. So if anyone's interested in hearing more about my experience about that, I'm happy to share it. But right now, let me get into some more of the sort of anxiety disorders that we can experience, because I want to cover this. So in the last session, I got up to a place where we were really talking about panic attacks and panic disorders. So the other area that I tend to see on occasions, not really all that regularly, are the specific phobias. And phobias are intense feelings of fear around certain objects, scenarios, animals, etc. The animal ones are particularly common. So one of the more common ones is arachnophobia. So how does a phobia manifest itself in your experience? Well, generally speaking, it's an excessive, constant fear of a specific situation or event or encounter. It's really an encounter. Is there a spider in your office? And I've had clients literally having to watch me, go through all the aspects in my office, showing them that the office has no spider webs in it and there are no spiders. And it's an instant feeling of terror when there is something that is even closely related to this. In one instance, there was a little spider web, but it was so, I didn't see it, but my client picked up on it really, really quickly. There's also a feeling of inability to control your fear, even when you know that this is completely irrational, and it's one of the frustrations. So finally, the other aspect in the diagnosis process is really that, this restricts your normal routine as a result of the fear. So it's really, really intense. Positive thing is there's some really, really good treatment strategies, and anyone suffering from a phobia, please think about reaching out to a therapist, because therapy with phobias can be quite straightforward in many respects and really makes a difference to your global functioning in life. Okay, the next one, which is interesting, is what we call agoraphobia. And the reason why it requires, in a sense, a separate addressing is because it's this process of a fear of going out in public, either the fear of open spaces or being in unfamiliar places. A lot of people who have agoraphobia also have panic attack disorders or panic disorders. And, often a panic attack leads to agoraphobia. It's like, the fear in a panic attack is that I'm going to faint, I'm going to pass out, and I won't be safe. So if or should the person have gotten close to it, suddenly they're going to be avoidant of going out in public or in those open spaces or unfamiliar spaces. And that becomes significant as a restrictor in their life. I mean, you can't live indoors all your life, although some people do really try. So some of the characteristic symptoms in this is, like a severe stress or anxiety whenever you're in an environment other than your home. Obsessive fears of socializing with groups of people, regardless of whether you know them or not. Having feelings of tension and stress even during regular activities, like going to the store, talking to a stranger, or even talking to familiar people out in that environment. So this is really, really important. Now, in my history, one of the key areas that I specialised in is post-traumatic stress disorder. And as you may, if you're following the podcast, have heard from me, is that I started working with combat veterans very early on in my career, mainly initially through, my work in drug and alcohol and addictions, and then further on specialising very much in the treatment of post-traumatic stress disorder from, with all sorts of people, first responders, combat veterans, people who've been in severe industrial accidents, those sorts of things. And, one of the things that we've got to acknowledge is that there's always going to be situations to which we are actually at risk, where our life can actually be in danger. And some people do jobs that are just ridiculously dangerous. A lot of people, many, many, many people are lucky enough to avoid these dangers and, generally speaking, feel that they've got a fairly safe handle on things. Now, when we talk about post-traumatic stress disorders, we also got to understand that this diagnosis has evolved historically through several incarnations. And the first one was, in fact, probably the recognition that soldiers had what's called battle fatigue. And so as we went on into the 70s and early 80s, part of the sort of diagnosis of post-traumatic stress disorder was that you encountered a potentially life-threatening situation or were involved in a life-threatening situation. To some degree, I think we've gotten a bit better at broadening this out, because it doesn't necessarily need to be a manifest life-threatening sensation, but one that you perceive to be as such. And it's usually a pattern of symptoms that establishes after intense traumatic events that have occurred. So it's one of those anxiety disorders that's highly complex and requires as much help as possible. You can't necessarily. I don't know anybody who's had PTSD of a acute or chronic way in which they've overcome it on their own. And the sooner we can intervene, the better. There's also a question about why is it that some people get PTSD and other people tend to not suffer from post-traumatic stress disorder. One of my observations in this area was, in fact, that people who have had a very stable, secure attachment as a child to their caregivers seem to be a bit more resilient to this. It's not foolproof by any means, but there is a capacity to be more flexible and more resilient to the impact of the traumatic event and how the person construes themselves in that context of the traumatic event. So what sort of symptoms are we talking about? Well, the first one is about reliving the trauma. And this can be often in dreams, it can be in flashbacks. In a lot of cases, they experience the trauma both mentally and physically. And, we talk about flashbacks where they seem to be transported back to the event. I've got lots of stories where I can, could share some light on that. The other one is responding to triggers. And so sounds and smells are particularly relevant in this context. With the combat veterans, one of the things that I often heard from them about was they never lose that smell of death or blood that they've been exposed to, and so that makes them highly sensitized. And so, this startle response fundamentally is also very, very high. The brain seems to go on, a massive alert that never shuts down. So another feature of this is that there's an anxiety of reoccurrence. You sort of I always talk about hypersensitivity, hyperreactivity, and hypervigilance. So one of the things that I used to hear a lot from a lot of people with chronic PTSD was that in order to feel safe, they often needed to place themselves in, say, for example, a restaurant where they had a complete overview of the restaurant, where they could see pretty well everybody coming in and going out. If they didn't have that, they were extraordinarily uncomfortable. So that's very, very important. And so the other aspect in the symptomatology is the regulation of emotions and the attempt to find all sorts of strategies in which they can deal with the hyperreactivity. They often know they're responding outside of what would be appropriate to the situation, but they often talk about, I can't seem to stop myself. So anger and rage become a very important part of the picture for a lot of them. For others, it's like a disinterest or detachment, especially from positive emotions like love and affections. So they numb out. And part of the fallacy in their thinking is, the idea of, well, what's the point? It's all going to go to shit anyway. And this is where it gets absolutely fundamentally important to try and help the person to recreate, firstly, desensitize, the original trauma and trauma reaction, and then work with them to re-establish in themselves a more constructive relationship to themselves, which is often highly impaired, but also a way of looking at the world and understanding that I need to be flexible in terms of what happens around me. Okay, so it's this hypersensitivity, hyperreactivity, and hypervigilance that I keep targeting as part of the symptom cluster, but also the person's relationship with themselves. Because if I can get them to recognize that they're not at fault, that they weren't morally culpable, or that they weren't the cause of the trauma, then I've got a better chance in having that person take some control and learn how to live with what they've gone through. In some cases, I've seen people recover exceptionally well from even chronic post-traumatic stress disorder, although we don't talk about, being cured, because the brain has this tendency to want to keep going back to this stuff. All right, I hope these sessions, these particular podcasts on anxiety and what anxiety is, has been really helpful for you to understand, what's active in your life and what isn't. And anyone who experiences anything like that, please let me encourage you to seek out help in your area, either through your GP, your mental health services, word of mouth for a good therapist, someone who's well trained, well skilled in dealing with these sorts of issues, because there is a light at the end of the tunnel. And as I often point out to anyone with PTSD, it doesn't necessarily mean it's a train, right? That's our catastrophic construction, but it could be something else, something benign. It's the capacity to return to something that's benign. Okay, now the next podcast is going to be one of those with my wife, and it'll be a nice 50-minute session in which we're going to have an overview of the last year and picking out what we both have felt has been highly relevant in our understanding of inspiring change and how we view how it is that we are living in a volatile and essentially challenging environment, because it has been somewhat more challenging. And if you pay a lot of attention to the news and so on, it's going to look even worse. So this is me signing off until next time. Speak to you soon and hope you'll join in.
Thank you for listening to Inspire Change, a broadcast that strives to educate, motivate, and empower men to challenge traditions of masculinity. For more information on the Making Good Men Great movement, or for individual or group coaching sessions with Gunter, visit makinggoodmengreat.com. For inquiries regarding broadcast topics or appearing on the show, email Miranda at noirtainment.com. That's Miranda at NOIRTAINMENT.com.